The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and sleepless nights, the kind of place where joy and fear walked hand in hand. Outside the maternity ward, a young woman sat on a narrow bench, her shoulders hunched, one hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. She had given birth only hours earlier, yet instead of warmth and congratulations, she was met with sharp words and colder looks. Her mother-in-law stood before her like a judge delivering a sentence, voice low but cutting, insisting that she leave at once. There was no room for gratitude, no acknowledgement of pain endured. Only accusations, bitterness, and a demand that felt final. The older woman spoke of shame, of family reputation, of mistakes that could not be forgiven. She claimed the child did not belong in their world, that the daughter-in-law had brought nothing but trouble. Nurses slowed their steps as they passed, pretending not to hear while catching every word. The young mother's eyes filled, but she refused to cry. She had learned that tears only fueled the fire. Instead, she stood, swaying slightly, and gathered her few belongings, ready to walk out into the night with nowhere to go. Just as the automatic doors slid open, a sudden guest appeared. His presence changed the air instantly. Conversations hushed, footsteps stopped. He was calm, well-dressed, and carried himself with a quiet authority that demanded attention without asking for it. He looked from the trembling young woman to the rigid mother-in-law and asked, simply, what was going on. The older woman opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. For the first time, she hesitated. He listened as the story spilled out in broken fragments. He did not interrupt, did not raise his voice. When she finished, he turned to the mother-in-law and said a sentence that landed harder than any insult, "You're rushing to the wrong station." The metaphor was gentle, but its meaning was unmistakable. She was fighting the wrong battle, punishing the wrong person, clinging to pride while losing what truly mattered. The mother-in-law stood frozen, her anger dissolving into shock. In that moment, power shifted. The young woman was no longer alone. The scene felt eerily familiar to anyone who had watched public confrontations unfold under bright studio lights. Across the ocean, in a very different setting, another clash had captured attention. On a popular daytime talk show, an interview meant to be light and celebratory had taken a sharp turn. Julia Roberts sat across from Joy Behar, initially relaxed, smiling as anecdotes and laughter flowed easily. The audience expected charm and warmth, the kind Julia had built her career on. But as the conversation shifted, so did the tone. A question, framed casually, carried an edge. It touched on personal choices, values, and judgments that Julia had long kept private. At first, she responded with grace, choosing her words carefully, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Joy pressed on, perhaps sensing tension, perhaps underestimating it. The studio grew quieter. Smiles stiffened. What had been playful banter turned into a subtle tug of war. Julia's expression changed. The warmth faded, replaced by a firmness that signaled a boundary had been crossed. She spoke clearly, not angrily, but with a resolve that left no doubt. She explained that some lines were not meant to be crossed for the sake of entertainment. She spoke about respect, about how public curiosity does not grant ownership over someone's life. Each word was measured, but the message was unmistakable. Joy attempted to lighten the mood, offering a joke, but it fell flat. The audience sensed what was coming before it happened. Julia took a breath, thanked the hosts, and stood up. Chairs shifted, microphones rustled. The moment stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Without raising her voice or looking back, she walked off the set. Cameras followed instinctively, capturing a rare sight, a Hollywood icon choosing dignity over decorum. Reactions were immediate and divided. Some applauded her for standing up for herself, calling it a powerful reminder that even celebrities have limits. Others criticized the walk-off as dramatic, suggesting she could have handled it differently. But regardless of opinion, the moment struck a nerve. It wasn't just about a talk show spat. It was about control, about who gets to define the narrative. Back in the hospital corridor, the sudden guest's words continued to echo. The mother-in-law's rigid posture softened. She looked around, aware for the first time of the watching eyes, the silent judgment. The young woman remained still, unsure whether to hope or brace for another blow. Slowly, the older woman stepped aside, clearing the path instead of blocking it. It was not an apology, not yet, but it was a retreat. Both scenes, though worlds apart, shared the same core. A confrontation sparked by entitlement, met by a refusal to be diminished. Whether in a maternity ward or a television studio, the message was clear: respect is not optional, and silence is not submission. Sometimes, the most powerful act is to stand up, or walk away, at the exact moment others expect you to stay quiet. The young mother took a step back into the ward, guided gently by a nurse. The sudden guest gave her a reassuring nod before leaving as quietly as he had arrived. The mother-in-law remained standing alone, forced to face the consequences of her words. Somewhere else, Julia Roberts' walk-off replayed on screens, sparking debates and conversations long after the studio lights dimmed. In both stories, the clash ended not with shouting, but with a pause, a moment that demanded reflection. And in that pause, something shifted, reminding everyone watching that dignity, once claimed, can never truly be taken away. The maternity hospital was unusually loud that evening, not with cries of newborns but with tension that clung to the walls. The young woman had imagined this day differently. She had pictured flowers, soft words, and a sense of belonging. Instead, she stood near the exit, pale and exhausted, while her mother-in-law's voice cut through the corridor like a blade. The older woman insisted that she leave immediately, claiming the family had been disgraced and that there was no place for her anymore. Each sentence felt rehearsed, as if this decision had been made long before the child was born. The daughter-in-law tried to speak, to explain, but her voice shook and failed her. Nurses exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. This was not the first family conflict they had witnessed, but something about the cruelty of it made the air feel heavier. The mother-in-law spoke of tradition and honor, of how neighbors would talk, of how mistakes followed women for life. To her, compassion seemed like a weakness. To the young mother, it felt like survival. With trembling hands, she reached for her bag. Her body ached, her heart even more so. Being forced out of the hospital felt like being erased at the very moment she needed protection the most. Just as she took a step toward the doors, a man entered the corridor, his presence commanding attention without effort. He was unexpected, clearly not part of the hospital staff, yet he carried himself with a calm certainty that made everyone pause. He asked what was happening, not loudly, not accusingly. The question itself was enough. The mother-in-law turned, ready to unleash her anger, but when she met his gaze, her words faltered. She repeated her grievances, but they sounded weaker now, stripped of their earlier force. The man listened carefully, then said something that changed everything: "You're heading to the wrong station. The train you're chasing won't take you where you think." The phrase hung in the air. It was not an insult, but it struck deeper than one. It suggested that her anger was misplaced, that her sense of control was an illusion. For the first time, the mother-in-law seemed unsure. Her lips pressed together, her eyes darted around, and she said nothing. Silence, in that moment, was louder than shouting. The young woman felt a fragile thread of hope tighten in her chest. Elsewhere, far removed from hospital walls, another confrontation was unfolding under the bright lights of daytime television. Julia Roberts sat on the familiar set of The View, the atmosphere initially warm and welcoming. Laughter flowed easily as she shared stories and smiled at the audience. Viewers expected charm, and she delivered it effortlessly. But as the discussion shifted, so did the mood. A question from Joy Behar, framed as curiosity, carried an edge that could not be ignored. It touched on personal territory, hinting at judgments about choices Julia had made outside the public eye. At first, she answered politely, redirecting with humor. But the questioning continued, pressing deeper, crossing from interest into intrusion. The studio audience sensed the tension building, a subtle unease replacing earlier laughter. Julia's expression hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. She spoke about boundaries, about how being in the public eye did not mean surrendering one's dignity. Her voice was steady, her posture composed. Joy attempted to soften the moment with a joke, but it was too late. The line had been crossed, and everyone in the room knew it. In a move that stunned the audience, Julia stood up. There was no dramatic outburst, no raised voice. She simply chose to leave. Cameras caught the moment as she thanked the hosts and walked off the set. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a rare act on live television, a refusal to participate in something that felt wrong. The reaction was immediate and intense. Social media lit up with praise and criticism in equal measure. Some viewers hailed her as a symbol of self-respect, applauding her for refusing to be cornered. Others accused her of overreacting, arguing that tough questions were part of the job. But beneath the noise, a deeper conversation emerged about consent, respect, and the power dynamics of public platforms. Back in the hospital, the mother-in-law's authority continued to crumble. She shifted her weight, avoiding eye contact, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. The man who had intervened did not lecture her further. He simply stood beside the young woman, a silent show of support. That alone was enough. The nurses resumed their work, tension easing slightly, as if the walls themselves exhaled. The daughter-in-law was guided back toward her room, her steps slow but steadier than before. She did not look back. The mother-in-law remained behind, forced to confront the consequences of her actions without an audience to intimidate. Her silence spoke volumes, revealing uncertainty where certainty had once ruled. Both stories, though unfolding in vastly different worlds, echoed the same truth. Whether in a private family conflict or a public media spectacle, there comes a moment when a person must choose between submission and self-respect. In both cases, the choice to stop, to stand firm, or to walk away reshaped the narrative. The hospital corridor returned to its usual sounds, but something had shifted. The young mother was no longer alone, and the power that had once threatened to crush her had been challenged. On television screens, Julia Roberts' walk-off replayed again and again, becoming a symbol of quiet defiance. Neither confrontation ended with loud victory or complete resolution. Instead, they ended with something more lasting, a reminder that dignity does not require permission, and that sometimes the most powerful response is not to argue, but to refuse to be moved.